The crack of Thunder Road's hoof connecting with Jacob Miles' skull echoed through the southern New Mexico State Fair arena like a baseball bat shattering against concrete. The sound was so sharp, so final, that even the carnival music from the midway seemed to stop. 24-year-old Jacob lay twisted in the dirt, his body contorted at an unnatural angle, blood spreading beneath his head in a dark crimson pool that reflected the October sun. Thunder Road stood over him for a terrifying moment, the massive black Brahma's eyes still wild with adrenaline, before the pickup riders managed to drive the bull away from Jacob's motionless form. The silence that followed was deafening. 2,000 spectators holding their breath as one, as if their collective will could somehow undo what they had just witnessed. Sarah Miles' scream shattered that silence. It was a sound that would haunt everyone who heard it, the primal wail of a mother watching her child's life hang in the balance. She clawed at the arena fence, her fingernails scraping against the metal as her husband Bill tried to hold her back. "That's my baby," she screamed. "Someone help him. Please, God, someone help my baby." Tommy Rodriguez vomited into the dirt beside the chute, his legs giving out as he realized what he had just seen. He and Jacob had been inseparable since they were 8 years old, dreaming of rodeo glory in the dusty backyards of Las Cruces. They had made a pact years ago to always watch each other's rides, to be there if something went wrong. Now Tommy was watching his best friend die, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. Dr. Elena Rodriguez reached Jacob first, her medical bag bouncing against her hip as she sprinted across the arena. What she found made her stomach lurch despite 15 years of emergency medicine experience. Jacob's head was turned at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, blood flowing freely from his ears and nose. His breathing was labored, making a horrible rattling sound with each struggled breath. "Jesus Christ," she whispered, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands moved automatically, checking vitals, but what she felt made her blood run cold. His pulse was erratic, his pupils dilated and unresponsive to light. When she lifted his eyelid, she could see blood vessels had burst in his eyes, painting the whites red. Jacob's body suddenly convulsed, his back arching off the ground as his muscles seized uncontrollably. Foam mixed with blood bubbled from his mouth, and Dr. Rodriguez had to fight the urge to step back. She had seen traumatic brain injuries before, but never one this severe in someone so young, someone she had watched compete for 3 years. "Get the helicopter," she shouted to the paramedics who were running toward them with a stretcher. "Memorial Medical won't be enough. We need to get him to University Hospital in Albuquerque. Now!" The arena had become a nightmare. Parents were covering their children's eyes and rushing toward the exits, but many spectators remained frozen in their seats, unable to look away from the horror unfolding in front of them. Some were crying, others praying, and a few were recording everything on their phones, a detail that would later cause fights in the parking lot as people's humanity collided with their digital age instincts. Bill Miles finally broke through the security barrier, Sarah close behind him. When they reached Jacob, Sarah's knees buckled. Her son's face was barely recognizable, swollen, bloody, his skin taking on a gray pallor that made him look already dead. Blood continued to seep from his ears, staining the dirt beneath him in widening circles. "My God, what did that animal do to him?" Sarah sobbed, reaching toward Jacob but afraid to touch him, afraid that even the gentlest contact might somehow make things worse. Dr. Rodriguez looked up at Jacob's parents, and in her eyes they could see the truth she was trying not to speak. This wasn't just a bad injury. This was life or death, and death was winning. "We need to get him airlifted immediately," she said, her voice professionally calm despite the chaos around them. "His brain is swelling. Every second counts." The helicopter's rotors were already beating overhead, the medical chopper circling the fairgrounds looking for a place to land. Jacob convulsed again, more violently this time, his body rigid with the seizure. Blood ran from his mouth, and his breathing became even more labored. "He's not going to make it," Tommy whispered to himself, standing behind the family. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and Sarah spun around, her face contorted with grief and rage. "Don't you say that," she screamed at Tommy. "Don't you dare say that about my son." But even as she yelled, she could see the same fear in Tommy's eyes that was consuming her own heart. The medical team worked frantically to stabilize Jacob enough for transport. They inserted a breathing tube, started IVs, and strapped him to a spinal board. Each movement seemed to make his condition worse. More blood, more convulsions, more signs that Jacob Miles was slipping away from them with each passing second. "I should have stopped him," Bill said quietly, his voice barely audible over the helicopter noise. "I should have made him quit after that fall in Roswell last month. I knew something like this would happen. I knew it, and I let him keep riding anyway." The helicopter touched down in the dirt parking lot behind the arena, kicking up clouds of dust that mixed with the smoke from barbecue grills and the exhaust from carnival generators. The medical team rushed Jacob toward the aircraft, his parents running alongside the stretcher. Sarah kept one hand on the stretcher rail, as if letting go would mean losing her son forever. As they loaded Jacob into the helicopter, his eyes opened for just a moment. Sarah's heart leaped with hope, but what she saw in those eyes wasn't recognition or awareness. It was the vacant stare of someone whose mind was already somewhere else, somewhere far away from the pain and the chaos and the desperate voices calling his name. "I love you, Jake," she whispered, squeezing his hand as the medical team worked around her. "You fight, you hear me? You fight to come back to us." But Jacob's eyes had already closed again, and his hand felt cold and limp in hers. As the helicopter lifted off, carrying her son toward an uncertain future, Sarah Miles collapsed into her husband's arms and let out a sound that would echo through the empty arena long after the lights went dark. The trauma bay at University Hospital in Albuquerque looked like a war zone. Jacob Miles lay on the gurney, his body connected to more machines than Sarah had ever seen in her life. Monitors beeped incessantly, displaying numbers that meant nothing to her but seemed to cause concerned looks among the medical staff. His face was so swollen that he was barely recognizable as her son. Dr. Michael Chun, the hospital's chief neurosurgeon, emerged from the trauma room with blood on his scrubs and exhaustion etched across his face. He had been operating for 6 hours straight, fighting to save Jacob's life while his parents and friends maintained their vigil in the waiting room. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under his eyes, making him look older than his 45 years. "Mr. and Mrs. Miles," Dr. Chin said, his voice carefully controlled. "I need to speak with you about Jacob's condition." Sarah gripped Bill's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They had been at the hospital for 8 hours, watching medical personnel rush in and out of Jacob's room, seeing the increasingly grim expressions on their faces. Tommy had driven up from Las Cruces with half the rodeo community, and the waiting room was filled with cowboys, barrel racers, and ranch families who had known Jacob since he was a boy. "How is he, doctor?" Bill asked, though the tone in Dr. Chen's voice already suggested the answer wouldn't be what they wanted to hear. Dr. Chen gestured toward a small consultation room away from the crowd in the waiting area. As they walked, Sarah noticed that his steps seemed heavy, reluctant. She had seen that walk before, when the veterinarian had come to tell them about their old ranch dog, when the principal had called about Jacob's accident in high school shop class. It was the walk of someone who had to deliver news that would change everything. The consultation room was sterile and cold, with motivational posters on the walls that seemed grotesquely cheerful given the circumstances. Dr. Chen closed the door and sat across from them, his hands folded on the table between them. For a moment, nobody spoke. "Jacob suffered what we call a severe traumatic brain injury," Dr. Chen began. "The impact caused multiple skull fractures and significant swelling of the brain tissue. We've performed emergency surgery to relieve the pressure, but..." He paused, clearly struggling with how to continue. Sarah felt her heart sink even further, something she hadn't thought was possible. "But what?" Bill pressed, his rancher's directness cutting through the medical euphemisms. "The damage is extensive," Dr. Chin said quietly. "The area of the brain that controls consciousness, breathing, and basic functions has been severely compromised. We've induced a medically controlled coma to allow his brain time to heal, but I need you to understand that the next 48 hours are critical." Sarah's world seemed to tilt sideways. "What are you saying? Is he going to wake up?" Dr. Chen's pause lasted too long. When he finally spoke, his words felt like physical blows. "Mrs. Miles, I want to be honest with you. The type of injury Jacob sustained, many patients don't survive. Those who do often face significant long-term complications. We're talking about potential memory loss, motor function problems, personality changes. In some cases, patients remain in what we call a persistent vegetative state." The room went completely silent except for the distant sounds of the hospital. Monitors beeping, pages being announced, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum floors. Sarah felt like she was drowning, like the air had been sucked out of the room. "You're talking about my son like he's already gone," she said, her voice rising with each word. "He's 24 years old. He's strong. He's a fighter. I understand this is devastating news," Dr. Chin said gently. "And you're right, Jacob is young and was in excellent physical condition before the accident. That works in his favor. But I would be doing you a disservice if I didn't explain the reality of his injuries. Bill stared at the table, his jaw working silently. Finally, he looked up at the doctor. What happens now? We monitor him closely. We watch for any signs of improvement or deterioration. The machines are breathing for him, monitoring his heart rate and brain activity. We'll do everything we can to give him the best chance possible, but much of what happens next is beyond our control. Sarah stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. I want to see him. I need to see my son. Dr. Chen nodded. Of course. But I should prepare you. He looks very different than when he left the arena. The swelling, the medical equipment, it can be overwhelming. They walked through the hospital corridors in silence, past other families dealing with their own crises, past rooms where other people's worlds were falling apart. The ICU was quieter than the rest of the hospital, filled with the soft whoosh of ventilators and the steady beeping of monitors that were keeping people alive. Jacob's room was the third on the left. Sarah stopped in the doorway, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. The person in the bed didn't look like her son. Jacob's head was wrapped in white bandages, his face so swollen that his eyes were nearly hidden. Tubes ran from his mouth and nose, and wires seemed to be attached to every part of his body. "Oh, Jake," she whispered, approaching the bed slowly. "What have they done to you?" She reached out to touch his hand, the only part of him that looked relatively normal, though it felt cold and lifeless in hers. His fingers, usually calloused from rope work and ranch labor, seemed smaller somehow, fragile in a way that Jacob had never been. Bill stood at the foot of the bed, staring at his son with an expression Sarah had never seen before. It was the look of a man watching his future disappear, of a father realizing that all his plans and dreams for his child might be ending in this sterile room filled with machines. The ranch was going to be his someday, Bill said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. 4 generations of Miles ranchers. He was supposed to take over when I got too old to handle the cattle. Sarah squeezed Jacob's hand, searching for any sign of response, any indication that her son was still somewhere inside the broken body on the bed. "He's going to wake up," she said firmly. "I don't care what the doctors say. I know my son, and he's not going to give up without a fight." Tommy appeared in the doorway, his hat in his hands and his eyes red from crying. He had been Jacob's shadow since childhood, and seeing his best friend like this was destroying him in ways that were visible to anyone who looked. "Mrs. Miles, I'm so sorry," Tommy said, his voice cracking. "I should have talked him out of riding Thunder Road. I knew that bull was dangerous. Everyone knew." "This isn't your fault, Tommy," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. In her heart, she was blaming everyone, Tommy for not stopping Jacob, Bill for not forbidding him to compete, the stock contractor for bringing such a dangerous bull to the fair, and most of all, herself for not insisting that Jacob find a safer way to make a living. The ICU nurse, a middle-aged woman named Patricia who had been working trauma care for 20 years, entered the room to check Jacob's monitors. She moved efficiently around the bed, recording numbers and adjusting settings with the practiced ease of someone who had seen too many young people in similar conditions. "How long has he been like this?" Patricia asked, though she already knew the answer from the chart. 14 hours, Bill replied. 14 hours since the accident. Patricia nodded, making notes on her clipboard. "The first few days are always the hardest. For the patient and for the family. Is there anything I can get you? Coffee, something to eat?" Sarah shook her head. The thought of food made her stomach turn. She hadn't eaten since breakfast the morning of the rodeo, but hunger seemed irrelevant now. Everything that had mattered yesterday. The championship standings, the prize money, Jacob's plans to use his winnings to buy more cattle for the ranch. All of it seemed impossibly trivial now. "Has he moved at all?" Sarah asked. "Opened his eyes? Anything?" Patricia's expression was kind but realistic. "Mrs. Miles, he's in a medically induced coma. The medications we're giving him are designed to keep his brain as quiet as possible while it heals. Any movement you might see would likely be involuntary reflexes, rather than conscious responses." As if summoned by their conversation, Jacob's body suddenly jerked, his back arching off the bed. The monitors immediately started beeping more rapidly, and Patricia quickly moved to his side, checking his pupils with a pen light and adjusting one of the 4 drips. "What's happening?" Sarah demanded, gripping the bed rail. "Is he waking up?" "It's a seizure," Patricia explained, her voice calm and professional. "This is unfortunately common with brain injuries of this severity. The medication I'm giving him should stop it." Sarah watched in horror as her son's body was racked with convulsions, his muscles rigid and trembling. The seizure lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. When it finally ended, Jacob's body went completely limp, and the only sounds in the room were the mechanical breathing of the ventilator and the steady beeping of his heart monitor. "Will that happen again?" Bill asked. "Possibly," Patricia replied honestly. "We're doing everything we can to prevent them, but with injuries like this, seizures are often part of the recovery process. If recovery is what happens." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah sank into the chair beside Jacob's bed, suddenly feeling every one of her 48 years. She had aged decades in the past day, watching her vibrant, reckless son reduced to this still form surrounded by machines. "I should call his sister," Sarah said suddenly. "Maria needs to know what happened." Maria Miles Martinez lived in Phoenix with her husband and 2 young children. She had always been the responsible one, the one who went to college and got married, and had a normal life while Jacob chased his rodeo dreams. Sarah dreaded making the call, knowing that Maria would drop everything and drive through the night to get to Albuquerque. "I'll call her," Bill offered, but Sarah shook her head. "No, it should come from me. She's going to ask questions I can't answer, and she's going to want to know if." Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. She couldn't say the words that everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to speak aloud. Tommy stepped forward. "Mrs. Miles, I can stay here with Jake while you make the call. Someone should be with him." Sarah looked at Tommy gratefully. Despite his youth and his obvious devastation, he was trying to be strong for Jacob's family. She nodded and walked toward the door, then stopped and turned back to look at her son one more time. "I'll be right back, baby," she whispered to Jacob. "Mama's going to call Maria, and then I'll be right back. You just keep fighting, okay? Keep fighting for us." But Jacob lay silent and still, his chest rising and falling only with the mechanical assistance of the ventilator. The boy who had never been quiet or still in his entire life was now both, and the contrast was heartbreaking in ways that words couldn't capture. As Sarah walked toward the family phone area, she passed other families in various stages of their own medical crises. Some were celebrating small victories, others were saying goodbye, and a few, like her, were trapped in the terrible uncertainty of waiting to see which direction their loved one's story would go. She dialed Maria's number with shaking fingers, rehearsing in her mind how to tell her daughter that her brother might never wake up, might never ride bulls again, might never be the same person they had all loved and worried about for 24 years. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before Maria's cheerful voice answered. "Hi, Mom. How did Jake do at the rodeo today? Did he win?" Sarah closed her eyes and tried to find the words to destroy her daughter's normal, happy evening. Outside the hospital windows, the sun was setting over Albuquerque, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that would have been beautiful on any other day. "Maria, honey," Sarah began, her voice already breaking. "I need you to sit down. Something's happened to your brother. 2 months. 63 days of machines breathing for Jacob Miles, of monitors tracking every heartbeat, of Sarah sleeping in a chair beside his bed and Bill driving back and forth between the hospital and the ranch to keep their cattle business from collapsing. 63 days of doctors speaking in careful, measured tones about brain activity levels and Glasgow Coma Scale scores, and the increasingly slim possibility of meaningful recovery. The ICU had become Sarah's second home. She knew every nurse by name, could read Jacob's monitors better than some medical students, and had memorized the patterns of his breathing, the rhythm of his heartbeat, the way his body looked smaller and frilier with each passing day. The muscular young man who had fearlessly climbed onto the backs of 2,000-pound bulls was disappearing before her eyes, replaced by a pale shadow connected to machines. Dr. Chen found Sarah there on a Tuesday morning in December, reading aloud from the Las Cruces Sun News sports section as she did every day, telling Jacob about the high school basketball scores and the upcoming rodeo season that he would miss. She looked up when the doctor entered, and he could see the toll these 2 months had taken on her. Her hair had gone almost completely gray, and she had lost so much weight that her clothes hung loose on her frame. "Mrs. Miles, could we speak privately for a moment?" Dr. Chen asked, his tone carrying the weight of conversations that no parent ever wanted to have. Sarah's heart clenched. After 63 days, she had learned to read the subtle signs in the medical staff's behavior. The way Dr. Chen avoided direct eye contact, the deliberate calmness in his voice, the fact that he had asked to speak privately rather than including Bill in the conversation. It all pointed toward news she wasn't ready to hear. "Is it about the test results from yesterday?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. They had run another series of brain scans the day before, the fourth set since Jacob's accident. Each previous set had shown minimal improvement, and Sarah had watched Dr. Chen's expression grow more concerned with each report. "Yes," Dr. Chen said simply. "I think we need to discuss Jacob's long-term prognosis." They moved to the same consultation room where they had first learned about the severity of Jacob's injuries. The motivational posters on the walls seemed even more obscene now, their cheerful messages about perseverance and positive thinking feeling like mockery in the face of what they were dealing with. Dr. Chen sat across from Sarah and pulled out Jacob's latest brain scans. To Sarah's untrained eye, they looked like any of the other dozens of scans she had seen over the past 2 months, black and white images that supposedly told Jacob's story but looked like abstract art to her. "Sarah," Dr. Chen began, using her first name for the first time, a small intimacy that somehow made everything feel more ominous. "Jacob's brain activity has remained consistently minimal throughout his time here. These latest scans show that the areas damaged in the accident haven't shown any significant signs of healing." Sarah stared at the images, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. "But he's still alive. His heart is beating. He's breathing." "The ventilator is breathing for him," Dr. Chen corrected gently. "His heart is beating, yes, but the parts of his brain that control consciousness, that make him who he is as a person, those areas show very little activity." The room felt like it was spinning. Sarah gripped the arms of her chair, trying to anchor herself to something solid. "What are you saying exactly?" Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could see him choosing his words carefully. "I'm saying that after 2 months with no significant improvement, the likelihood that Jacob will ever wake up, ever be the person you remember, becomes increasingly small. The medical term is persistent vegetative state, and I'm afraid that appears to be where Jacob is headed." Sarah felt like she had been punched in the stomach. For 63 days, she had maintained hope through sheer force of will, believing that Jacob's strength and youth would eventually win out over his injuries. She had ignored the increasingly gentle suggestions from the medical staff about managing expectations and considering quality of life issues. "But people do wake up from comas," Sarah said desperately. "I've read about it. People who were unconscious for months or even years and then suddenly woke up." "That does happen occasionally," Dr. Chen acknowledged. "But Sarah, I need you to understand that Jacob isn't in a coma in the traditional sense. The parts of his brain that were damaged control not just consciousness, but personality, memory, motor function. Even if he did wake up, he wouldn't be the Jacob you know." Sarah stood up abruptly, pacing to the small window that looked out over the hospital parking lot. Below, she could see people coming and going, living their normal lives while her world had been frozen in this nightmare for 2 months. "He moved yesterday," she said suddenly, turning back to Dr. Chen. "I saw his hand twitch when I was reading to him." Dr. Chen's expression was infinitely patient and kind, which somehow made it worse. "Those are involuntary muscle spasms, Sarah. They're common in patients with brain injuries. They don't indicate consciousness or awareness." The words felt like they were coming from far away. Sarah sank back into her chair, the full weight of what Dr. Chen was telling her finally sinking in. Jacob wasn't going to wake up. Her son, the boy who had never been able to sit still for 5 minutes, who lived for the adrenaline rush of dangerous rides and dangerous animals, was gone. His body was still alive, but Jacob, the essence of who he was, had died in that arena 2 months ago. "What happens now?" Sarah asked, her voice hollow. "That's something you and Bill need to discuss," Dr. Chen said. "We can continue the current level of care indefinitely. Many families choose to move patients to long-term care facilities that specialize in this type of situation. Others decide to withdraw life support and let nature take its course." The clinical language couldn't disguise what he was really asking her to consider. Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. They were talking about letting her son die, about turning off the machines that were keeping him alive. "I can't make that decision," Sarah said, shaking her head. "I can't decide to kill my own child." "You wouldn't be killing him," Dr. Chen said softly. "You would be allowing him to die naturally from his injuries. The machines are artificially prolonging a life that may no longer have any quality or meaning." Sarah wanted to scream at him, to tell him that Jacob's life had meaning as long as his heart was beating, as long as there was any chance, no matter how small, that he might wake up. But she could see in Dr. Chen's eyes that he had had this conversation with hundreds of other families, that he had seen the slow torture of maintaining false hope. "I need to talk to my husband," Sarah said finally. "I can't make this decision alone." Dr. Chen nodded. Of course. Take as much time as you need. There's no rush to make any decisions. But I wanted you to understand where Jacob stands medically so you can make informed choices about his care. Sarah walked back to Jacob's room in a daze, feeling like she was moving through water. The familiar sounds of the ICU, the ventilators, the monitors, the soft conversations between nurses, seemed muted and distant. She stopped in the doorway of Jacob's room, looking at her son's still form with new eyes. For 2 months, she had seen a young man fighting to recover from a terrible injury. Now she saw what the medical staff had been seeing, a body being kept alive by machines, with no evidence that the mind inside it was still functioning. Jacob's face had a waxy, artificial look, and his body seemed to have shrunk even more in the hours since she had left for her meeting with Dr. Chen. Tommy was sitting beside the bed, as he had every day for the past 2 months. He had put his own rodeo career on hold to maintain this vigil, sleeping in the waiting room most nights and taking over when Bill and Sarah needed breaks. He looked up when Sarah entered, and she could see in his face that he somehow knew what Dr. Chen had told her. "The doctor talked to you," Tommy said. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She moved to her usual chair on the other side of Jacob's bed, automatically checking his monitors even though the numbers had remained virtually unchanged for weeks. "What did he say?" Tommy asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. "He said Jacob isn't coming back," Sarah replied, her voice flat and emotionless. "He said the Jacob we knew is gone." Tommy was quiet for a long time, staring at his best friend's face. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. "I've been thinking the same thing for weeks. I just didn't want to say it out loud." Sarah looked across the bed at this young man who had been Jacob's constant companion, who had shared every adventure and misadventure of Jacob's life. "You think we should let him go?" Tommy's eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. Miles, Jacob would hate this. Being helpless, being dependent on machines, having people make decisions for him. You know he would. He'd rather die than live like this." The truth of Tommy's words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Jacob had always been fiercely independent, had always lived life on his own terms. The idea of him being trapped in a body that no longer worked, in a mind that couldn't think or dream or plan, was almost worse than the idea of losing him completely. "But what if the doctors are wrong?" Sarah asked. "What if he could still wake up?" Tommy reached across the bed and took her hand. "Look at him, Mrs. Miles. Really look at him. That's not Jake in there anymore. Jake would have been raising hell, driving the nurses crazy, demanding to know when he could get back on a bull. This person lying here, it's not him." Sarah looked at her son, trying to see past the machines and the medical equipment to the essence of who he had been. Jacob had never been quiet or still. Even sleeping, he had tossed and turned, kicked off blankets, talked in his sleep about horses and cattle and 8-second rides. The stillness of the person in the bed was so fundamentally unlike Jacob that it was like looking at a stranger. Bill arrived an hour later, coming directly from the ranch where he had been dealing with a sick calf. He took one look at Sarah's face and knew immediately that something had changed. "What did the doctor say?" he asked, settling into the chair on the other side of Jacob's bed. Sarah told him everything, watching Bill's face grow grayer with each word. When she finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, staring at his son's face. 63 days, Bill said finally. 63 days, and he hasn't opened his eyes once. Hasn't moved on his own. Hasn't given us any sign that he's still in there. "The doctor said we need to make a decision about his care," Sarah said. "About whether to continue the machines or—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but Bill understood. They sat in silence, both of them grappling with a choice that no parent should ever have to make. Outside Jacob's room, the hospital continued its round-the-clock rhythm of caring for the living and the dying, of families celebrating recoveries and mourning losses. What would Jacob want? Bill asked finally. It was the question Sarah had been avoiding for 2 months. She knew her son, knew his fierce independence and his hatred of being controlled or limited in any way. Jacob would rather die as himself than live as something less. "He would want us to let him go," Sarah whispered, the words feeling like they were tearing her throat. "But I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to tell them to turn off the machines keeping my baby alive." Tommy stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'll do it," he said quietly. "If you can't say the words, I'll talk to the doctor for you. Jacob was my best friend. I know what he would want, and I'll make sure it happens." Sarah looked at this young man who had been like a second son to her, who was offering to carry this burden, so she wouldn't have to. The generosity of the gesture broke her heart even further. "No," she said finally. "If anyone's going to make this decision, it should be his parents. It should be Bill and me." They called Dr. Chun back to the room an hour later. He listened as Sarah, with Bill's hand on her shoulder and Tommy standing guard beside Jacob's bed, made the hardest decision of her life. "We want to withdraw life support," Sarah said, the words feeling foreign and horrible in her mouth. "We want to let our son go." Dr. Chun nodded solemnly. "I think that's a very brave and loving decision. We can make arrangements for tomorrow morning. You'll have time to say goodbye, and we'll make sure Jacob is comfortable." As Dr. Chun left to make the necessary arrangements, Sarah took Jacob's hand for what might be the last time. His skin was warm from the heated blankets, but felt lifeless beneath her touch. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered. "I'm sorry I couldn't fight harder for you. I'm sorry I couldn't bring you back." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah knew she wasn't giving up on Jacob. She was finally letting him go. The machines fell silent at 8:17 a.m. on a cold December morning, their steady mechanical rhythms replaced by a quiet that seemed to fill every corner of Jacob's hospital room. Sarah held her son's hand as Dr. Chun switched off the ventilator, expecting to watch Jacob take his last breath within minutes. The medical staff had prepared them for a quick, peaceful death. Most patients in Jacob's condition passed away within 10 to 20 minutes once life support was withdrawn. But Jacob didn't die. His breathing was shallow and irregular, but it was breathing nonetheless. His heart rate, displayed on the monitor that Dr. Chun had left connected, showed a steady if weak rhythm. After an hour of waiting for their son to slip away,